Alright guys, here we are for the launch of Nvidia's RTX 50 series and Intel's Arrow Lake HX processor for laptops. And I'm here with Steve from Gamers Nexus.
Sorry about the laptop.
Yeah, we did have a RTX 5090 laptop until somebody tore it down.
It should still work. So you put it back together.
Luckily, we ran our full set of tests on it first. You know what's coming next? We both value your time, so we're just going to tell you the conclusion right now about what we found rather than make you watch this huge video. So when it comes to Intel's Arrow Lake HX, if you're running it at the max performance mode, you're not going to see that much difference coming from Intel's Raptor Lake HX, which may seem disappointing because Arrow Lake HX is 2 architectures newer and a die shrink newer. But that doesn't tell you the full truth. Once you delve in and run it at balance mode, which feeds the laptops less power, but gives you 85% of the performance, so thereby much less fan noise, much less heat you feel, we do see quite a big delta to the new Intel Arrow Lake HX CPU. It is just much more efficient. It's able to produce much more performance for the same power draw at those lower power limits, say 85 watts.
Yes, this is how Intel built the architectures, where we saw it first on desktop several months ago. The gains are inefficiency, and it was the same on the desktop side. It's just there's sometimes regression, so it could be worse, at least on desktop with Arrow Lake versus prior generations. And for desktop, not a good thing to have regression. For laptop, as long as you get the battery life benefit, that'll matter. But I didn't do those tests. You've got them in here, so.
Yeah, and also, not just battery life in terms of heat and fan noise, which is a big thing in a small chassis like this.
Yes.
So, thumbs up to Intel Arrow Lake HX. I would say though, if you're expecting it to be as big a jump as like Apple's M series launch or AMD's Ryzen launch, it's not at that like crazy revolutionary level, but it is a good step forward. Now, let's talk 5090 versus 4090, right?
It's boring. 5090 is boring.
Yeah. I mean, quite frankly, in gaming benchmarks with DLSS disabled, I know Nvidia would want us to enable it, we found it was 12% faster, so not a lot in it.
Yeah, short version is the 5090 in a laptop is really not comparable to the 5090 in a desktop. This is not news. They have done this in prior generations too. So much smaller die, a lot lower power, of course. And just because of how the 4090 laptop and 5090 laptop end up compared on a spec sheet, there's really not a ton of difference in the couple game tests I ran. So
yeah, and just on that, when we get to real world gaming, because I gave you the benchmarks before, in our real world gaming test, we did see a 27% increase, which seems much more exciting. That being said, some of that could be due to the better CPU. Now, what happens in gaming, in laptops in particular, they have a limited power that they can feed the chips. So what they tend to do is feed more power to the GPU and kind of feed less power to the CPU while gaming. Now, as I just said, the CPU performs quite well at less, when it's fed less power. So that could be equating to that greater number of average frames that we saw when we're looking at real world gaming, right? Now, but again, it depends on the game you're running.
I think the biggest thing on the laptop side is the VRAM increase for Nvidia. So what's moving to 24 gigabytes for the 5090?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, and there's a bump up in the 5080 as well. Yeah.
Right. So that seems like potentially useful, especially for people who are doing any type of, like for us, with 3D animations that we do occasionally and with video editing, we do actually burn through memory.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, it's segmented, right? Where just like in desktop, 5090 users, NVIDIA knows are going to typically be professional users who make money with the laptop. So they upcharge for it.
And just a side note on that as well, when we talk about VRAM, obviously AI, a lot of people who are going to be developing for AI and ML who are watching this channel, we are going to have a special video coming out on that topic, which will talk about, memory size, how fast is the memory. It'll talk about AMD Strix Halo, that sort of thing, coming soon, so get subscribed for that. When it comes to performance of the 4080 to the 5080, in this case we did see a little bit more. So for our gaming benchmarks, we saw 16% faster. Again, still not a lot in it though, but just be aware we got this Omen laptop with the 5080 in very late, so we weren't able to run our full set of tests on it, so you might see some missing as I walk you through the graphs. Look, I think that's a long enough intro, so let's jump into the data and we'll see you at the outro. Intel's Arrow Lake HX is a big jump from Intel's 14900 HX processor, which was found in high-powered laptops. The 14900 HX was really the same Raptor Lake processor as the 13900 HX that was released in Q1 2023, slightly higher clock speeds. So Arrow Lake HX is 2 architectures newer for Intel as it skips over Meteor Lake. It also has an improved manufacturing process, moving from Intel 7, which is based on their 10nm, to TSMC's 3nm. Intel actually called their 10nm process 7 because they wanted us to compare it to TSMC's 7nm, which they felt it was closer to. That being said, regardless, this is a big change. Arrow Lake HX has 8 P-cores and 16 E-cores. It no longer supports hyperthreading. Max gigahertz is actually lower than the 14th gen HX chip by between 200 to 300 megahertz, depending on which of these chips you get. TDP is pretty much unchanged. Cache is increased from 36 to 40 megabytes, and it can now run at a slightly higher max temperature of 105 Celsius. You also get slightly faster DDR5 memory. Compared to Intel's desktop K chip, the main difference is that the desktop version has a slightly higher max clock speed, but it can be fed far more wattage, up to 250 watts versus the laptop's 160. As these laptops do have Intel's highest-end CPUs inside, we're only going to compare them to other manufacturers' highest-end CPUs. One important note is that AMD's true competitor to this chip is the Ryzen HX 3D, but that is not out yet. AMD's Ryzen 9 HX chips came out mid-last year and can often be found in laptops with a similar price to Intel's less powerful Arrow Lake H CPUs. So please keep that in mind if you see Intel's HX processor beating AMD's Ryzen 9 HX processor. Alright, so that's a lot of stuff you probably don't care about. Here's how these actually perform. We're going to start with our scatter plot, as that is really the money slide. What this shows is how these laptops' processors perform in Cinebench versus how much power they draw. Cinebench is a good test for this as it maxes out CPU performance. You want to see as much performance as possible for as little power draw as possible. The different colors represent different processors in laptops that perform well with these chips. If you see dots joined, these tests are from the same laptop. If you see a lot of dots joined, like the Neo 16, that's where we manually changed wattage. If there are only a few, it means we use the manufacturer's various performance modes. In the case of Apple and Arrow Lake H, we tested these scores across multiple laptops, so that's why the dots aren't joined. The Arrow Lake 275 HX chip in the Neo 16 is what most new gaming laptops will use. When we look at it versus the prior version of this laptop, we see a substantial improvement, somewhere in the range of 37 to 15%. That's when fed the same wattage. That performance improvement is really apparent around 70 to 80 watts. Look, on average, I'd say it's a 26% improvement. It's off to a really good start. Compared with Intel's Arrow Lake H, HX is much more powerful. Compared to AMD Strix's Halo, Arrow Lake HX beats it, but not by that much. And our device with that chip is not running at the Halo's max wattage. Compared to the MacBook Pro with M4 Max, that laptop is just sitting there laughing, drawing 40% of the power of Arrow Lake HX for similar performance. But of course, you can't play the latest AAA games on a Mac. Look, in all seriousness, the reason we have included the Macs here is because, of course, programmers and creators, they do have a choice, right? They could go with a Windows gaming laptop or a MacBook Pro 16, something like that. So for them, this is interesting. Back on the graph, you can clearly see there are significant diminishing marginal returns of feeding this new processor more than around 85 watts. You may notice that both XMG laptops don't hit the max TDP of these chips during this test. That is likely because they're hitting thermal limits, and they do have to be dialed back a little. For example, a manufacturer can set ceilings that don't allow the chip to get hotter than a certain amount and don't run the fans louder than a certain amount. Let's double click in a little more. We ran each laptop on their highest performance modes. As you can see, the Neo 16 with the 275HX performs 19% faster in multi-core than the prior model, and 10% faster in single-core. The reason the multi-core gap here is on the smaller end of what we showed you earlier in our scatter plot is because it narrows at higher wattage. The only laptop that beats this one in single-core is Apple's M4 Max. On that note, the Neo 16 came with a 420 watt power supply. Prior to this, the biggest one we've seen is 330 watts. That being said, power bricks are getting smaller, and this one is actually slightly smaller and weighs around the same as one of our older 330 watts. The only laptop that beats this processor in single core is Apple's M4 Max. When it comes to CPU temps, heat you feel, and fan noise, this is really dependent on the laptop itself. This is something we'll focus on in our upcoming individual laptop reviews. Under a 10-minute CPU torture test, all these big laptops were able to maintain their full performance. The Flow Z13 with AMD Strix Halo was the only one that couldn't, but that's a tiny device. During this time, we measured CPU temperatures. The Omen CPU ran the hottest of our Windows laptops, averaging 100 degrees Celsius. The MacBook allows its CPU to run even hotter, an average of 105. When it comes to the XMG Neo 16, its fan noise goes up to 60 decibels, which is really loud for a gaming laptop. But there are different modes available. If you use balance mode, it will perform at 86% of turbo mode for less than half the power draw, and 14 decibels less fan noise. This really reinforces the diminishing marginal returns point I mentioned earlier. I don't know about you, but I'd take that trade-off. The Omen 16 is a little quieter, but we found in real-world use it was much quieter. Its fans really only spin up when you are pushing it. We will put our breakdown of that laptop's performance mode in our full review. Looking at heat you feel, the Omen does sensationally well. It remains very cool on the keyboard deck. Given its performance, this is incredibly impressive. The Neo 16 gets very hot. Steve does have a high-quality thermal imaging camera, which we should get for our studio. Anyway, we used it on both these laptops, and here's what we found.
All right, so I'm here with Josh and Sierra. We're setting up a thermal imaging solution. This is a Fluke RSE 600 thermal imaging camera. And there's a couple of caveats here in testing, kind of background detail. We won't get into depth with it. Short version is things like reflectivity. So we're looking at the image of the laptop on the table. The device under test is shown here. This is the screen for it. The screen temperature, as it's shown here, is sort of not real. It's just reflecting the environment, so we can ignore that. And then the emissivity is accounted for. So anyone who's like an infrared nerd, I guess your concerns are handled. For what we're showing, this is a quick look at hot spots through the surface and at what would be basically the skin temperature concerns. So for laptop use here, you can see where the palms would rest is actually very close to ambient. So we're at 23.3 degrees Celsius, and the room ambient locally on the table here is 22.6. So it's only a +1 degree, which is actually pretty great.
All right, let's talk Geekbench. This tests a variety of common performance tasks that can be hardware optimized by the CPU. The Arrow Lake HX processor in the Neo 16 performs marginally better than the older 14th gen, 9% in multi-core and 7% in single-core. The HP Omen barely beat out the older XMG 16, that's in multi-core. In single-core, it is better though. What's funny here is the Flow Z13 with AMD Strix Halo beats the Neo in this test, and that device is absolutely tiny. And of course, Apple's M4 Max wins here again.
This is a tile-based rendering workload entirely on the CPU using Blender. We have 4 laptop entries to the XMG unit that I ran overnight at GN, with the rest being desktop components. The desktop CPUs use all the same RAM, GPU, and memory, so the laptops are imperfect comparisons with more variables. However, even with that, this is so CPU and core bound that we'll mostly see the isolated differences to just the CPU. The 275HX ended up roughly around the same level as the 14900K desktop part previously. It's just below the limited 7950X in 105-watt eco mode at 8.3 minutes to complete the render. The 14900HX with turbo required an additional 2 minutes to complete the same render, so there is an improvement here. In the desktop world, we also saw the 285K improve over the 14900K in this test, which would be architecturally comparable. This was one of the ones where Intel's new CPUs didn't regress, and that applies to laptops as well, it seems.
Alright, so Intel's Arrow Lake HX processor, it is a good step forward for Intel, but it is not mind-blowingly better. Given that it is literally 2 architectures newer, Raptor Lake to Meteor Lake to Arrow Lake, and it's also got a die shrink, I was hoping for a bit more here. Let's see how Nvidia's RTX 50 series does. On the screen, we are comparing these new laptop GPUs to the desktop variants, which Steve claims are widely available at MSRP. Those draw a lot more power. We are also comparing these to the older 40 series. These new laptop GPUs have a higher starting wattage than their predecessors, up to 20 watts more for the 5080. There is also a new 5070 Ti, which fills the gap that was between the 4070 and the 4080. In case you're unaware, the 4070 didn't perform that much better than a 4060. You had to step up to the 4080, which was a lot more powerful. So it's nice that there is something in that gap. The 5090 gets 8GB more VRAM for a total of 24. The 5080 gets 4GB more for a total of 16. The 5070 Ti has 12GB. Unfortunately, the 5070 is unchanged at 8GB. Memory speed is much improved with the jump to DDR7. The rest of the changes are on screen. All our GPU-related benchmarks and real-world gaming tests were run at the laptop's highest settings. That's the fastest stock CPU and GPU performance mode. The GPU was always set to run directly and not via Optimus. And all laptops have at least 32GB of memory, so that won't be a bottleneck. In Timespy, which is a 1440 DirectX 12 rasterization benchmark, we see a whopping 13% increase in performance. Not off to a good start. In still Nomad, which is a more intensive 4K rasterization benchmark, we see a 14% increase in performance, so similar to Timespy. In Port Royal, which is a ray tracing benchmark, we see a similar 13% increase in performance. In Wildlife, which is a cross-platform Vulkan benchmark and therefore compatible with macOS, we see an 11% increase. To measure GPU power efficiency, we plotted Wildlife for various power draws. We chose this benchmark because we wanted to compare it to Apple's M series. What you can see is that the RTX 5090 appears to deliver about 15% more performance for the same power draw as last year's 4090. Compared to Apple's M4 Max, the RTX 5090 can perform up to 32% better, but it is far less efficient. For a Wildlife score of around 37,000, the M4 Max draws 75% of the power of the RTX 5090. In Cyberpunk's benchmark, we see an increase of 17%. One thing we do want to highlight is when we enable DLSS, the RTX 5090 laptop pulls further ahead. In Forza Horizon's benchmark, the RTX 5090 laptop is 14% faster. Like Cyberpunk, when we turn on DLSS, the gap widens, now to 37%. By the way, both Cyberpunk and Forza, they do support DLSS 4.
Hey everyone, Steve here from GN Now. So here's a quick gaming chart that I put together. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail at 4K max settings. This will put most of the load on the GPU and it helps isolate for the impact of the 5090 over the 4090 laptop components. The 4090 laptop with turbo landed at around the levels of the 7900 XT, just behind the 4070 Ti desktop part. The 5090 laptop solution was between the 3090 Ti and the 4070 Ti desktop GPUs. Lows are improved in the desktop counterparts and comparable between the 4090 and the 5090 laptops. The 5090 laptop improved by only 7.7% over the 4090 laptop, unfortunately. It's a little disappointing, but this is just in Final Fantasy XIV. That's the only game that my team had time to test for this one, so it'll look different in other ones, and you can see Josh's data for that in the rest of this video.
To test real-world gaming, we played the same part of several common games at different resolutions. We tested all games at 2560 by 1600, as that tends to be the native resolution of these laptops. In addition, for esports titles, we tested 1920 by 1200, and for pretty games, we instead added 4K. Please note, we didn't get the older version of the XMG Neo 16 in time to rerun our real-world gaming tests. What a mouthful. Anyway, we ended up substituting that laptop for the Strix Scar 18. It has the same components, but it does run about 4% worse than still Nomad, so just keep that in mind when looking at these graphs. In Fortnite at 1920, we see a sizable jump in performance, 33% in average frames and a whopping 77% in 1% lows. Stepping up to 2560, we see a 51% increase in average frames and an even larger 85% increase in 1% lows. This is our best result so far. If you want to spend 4K or more to play Fortnite, we have a winner. In Valorant at 1920 on low settings, we see a jump of 28% in average frames and a whopping 73% in 1% lows. Stepping up to 2560, also low settings, we see a jump of 32% in average frames and 158% in 1% lows. Just like Fortnite, a huge improvement in 1% lows. I do want to say one note on this one. We actually ran this game at low settings. That was for our esports pros. We wanted to see the absolute max frames possible. Our two resolutions had very similar average frames, and our 4080 laptop beat at our 4090. We believe this is because at these resolutions and on low settings, we are CPU bottlenecked. In Cyberpunk at 2560 in real-world gaming, we see a 17% increase in average frames and a 48% increase in 1% lows. The Cyberpunk benchmark we showed you earlier reported average frames, and it didn't reveal this. At 4K, we see an increase of 31% for average frames and an increase of 23% for 1% lows. In Warhammer Space Marine 2 at 2560, we see an increase of 12% in average frames and a 4% decrease in 1% lows. This is within a margin of error though. At 4K, we see an 18% increase in average frames and a 17% increase in 1% lows. We do want to call out that this is the only game that really wasn't playable at 4K on this new 5090 laptop. In Monster Hunter Wilds at 2560, we see an increase in 27% in average frames and 39% increase for 1% lows. At 4K, we see an increase of 17% for average frames and an increase of 56% for 1% lows. Monster Hunter Wilds was playable even at 4K. Stating the obvious, when compared to Space Marine 2, it is clear that your mileage will vary with these games based on the laptop itself. Let's now talk creative tasks. In Puget's Premiere Pro benchmark, this new RTX 5090 laptop crushed it, but it only performed 6% better than last year's version. We also tried a real-world export of one of our largest videos. In this case, the new RTX 5090 version did much better, 35% faster. This is one of our more impressive results. By the way, back on the Puget Premiere Pro benchmark, the big delta here between Apple's highest-end MacBook Pro 16 and these high-end Windows laptops actually matches Taylor and I's real-world experience. Although exporting is very similar, when editing from the timeline, the Mac struggles a lot with heavy effects and some of our more complex videos. I often have to stop playback to wait for it to catch up. Taylor's Strix Scar 18, it just doesn't struggle nearly as much. For Photoshop, we ran Puget's benchmark, not much better at all. This new RTX 5090 laptop saw a 2% increase. Alright, that was a lot of benchmarks and tests. Looking across all our results, here's where we landed. On average, in our CPU tests, this new Arrow Lake HX processor is 11% faster. For gaming benchmarks excluding DLSS, an average of 14% faster. For real-world gaming, an average of 27% more frames. For real-world gaming, on average, the 1% lows increased by 57%. For creator tasks, on average, 14% faster. Look, these real-world gaming results are very promising, but given how much they differ from our own benchmarks and Steve's, we really want to do more testing, so stay tuned. I really don't want to talk too much about battery life in this video because, folks, that's a factor of the laptop itself. So many components come into play, and this video is really about the CPU and GPU. That being said, if you want a little taste, here you go. We did do a full battery rundown, playing a movie on repeat with brightness lowered to 200 nits. All laptops were set to their best battery settings, which included running off the integrated GPU. This new RTX 5090 laptop lasted 3 hours and 51 minutes. Terrible. The older one lasted 4 hours and 49 minutes. These new components do require more power, and that is likely at play here. As I said, battery life is very dependent on the individual laptop itself. For example, our Legion Pro 7i does surprisingly well in this test with similar components. Lastly, let's take a look at pricing. Several of these older laptops no longer seem to be available, but luckily we have their data on our website, which tracks and saves prices. We compared 4 laptops with the same specs. This surprised us. Several manufacturers, including Razer and Lenovo, have either not increased their prices or increased it minimally. But others, like Asus and Electronics, have massively jacked up their prices. Asus could argue that their new Scar is redesigned, but so is Lenovo's Legion. So price changes are really dependent on which manufacturer you buy from. Also, as we all know, MSRPs don't really mean much. Laptops frequently go on big sales, which is exactly why we built that price tracker into our website, so you know when is the best time to buy. Well, that was a lot of graphs. I think our closing thoughts are this. This was not a great launch for an embargoed product. Honestly, this is probably the worst one I've ever seen coming out of Nvidia here. We had the laptops at CES. We weren't able to film them because we had to have the screens off. Then we had to go back and refilm them because
they had the screens
off. And they had to go back and refilm them all. Wasted everybody's friggin' time. And realistically, this laptop we got in, the XMG Neo 16, we probably got in about a week, maybe. We had about maybe 5 or 6, I'm looking at Sierra here, full days of testing on it. So that was decent, but still pretty minimal. And you had 6 hours or so, right?
That's right, I had about 6 hours on it. And in those 6 hours of testing I found one important bone we have to throw to Jensen Huang.
Oh, yes.
The 5070 is in fact equal to a 4090. Mm-hmm. As long as that 4090 is in a laptop.
I thought that was a very good comment.
So they've done it. They finally did what Jensen said was possible. The 5070 desktop in the one test I ran was like a 4090 laptop. And it's just, it's the 50 series has been and remains a mess of a launch. So, but the ROPs are on these devices.
Yeah, that's true. We had 112 on the, which is the correct number, on the 5090, and we had 96 on the 5080.
That's right. Yeah.
Overall, most people should wait, okay? Most people should not buy these for, I would say, at least a month till we get some, a lot of reviews, a lot of deep dives into them.
Allow the data to develop, because like Josh and anyone else reviewing these, you're going to get more in. And it's just like what we went through where when the 5090 launched, it was kind of hard for us to really nail down a value conclusion until the next card came out. And so with NVIDIA giving you guys such limited time, with the 5080 arriving like days ago, I guess, from the partners, or the 5080. It just, some extra time you'll be able to shake out what the real conclusions are.
Absolutely. And if you're looking at, I won't call out every channel to watch, but I'd check out Jared's Tech, Hardware Canucks. They tend to do some good deep dives on laptops, just like we'll be doing. Big thanks, of course, to Steve, who actually sponsored this tour of
That's
coming.
That's right. Before that, this video is brought to you by me.
Yep.
That was different. We haven't done that before.
Yeah, it's the first time we've been sponsored by another YouTuber, so that's really awesome.
Perfect, No, it was fun. I mean, I liked working on the testing I ran overnight was pretty interesting, just from looking at how it performs standpoint, because if you look at the 5090 versus 5080 desktop. That's they're really kind of comparable in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
On the spec sheet, and yeah, getting the chance to actually run some of the same tests we do for the larger hardware. It's not something we don't really get to do. Yeah, so I definitely appreciate you leaving the laptops for me to work on.
Yeah, and same for us, because often we discuss internally, right, at the price point of some of these, not this one, but some of these that are $4,000, we've seen what, $6,000 is crazy. You know, you can buy a really good desktop and a laptop, even, and a small gaming laptop like a 4070, right? So not for everyone, that's not a choice. If you're living in a small apartment, clearly that might not be a choice, but you know, we were interested to see how these perform versus the desktop, so that was very interesting.
And I think there's a lot more that could be done there too, so there should be more to check out soon.
Yeah, and other than that, you know, I think we've already mentioned, but thank you to XMG for being the manufacturer who sent us one of these laptops with enough time to test. Alienware, I do want to do a shout out to them. They provided us with these fantastic gaming monitors, 4K high resolution, obviously high refresh rate. That allowed us to really test out the capabilities of these laptops, so yay to them. And I think with that said, guys, let's close. So get subscribed to Steve's channel. His link will be below. As he said, got a lot more content coming. Get subscribed to us. In fact, on that note, guys, it makes a huge difference, so please do. And till next time, I think we'll see you later.
See ya.